Celeste Mercer did not look back when the flatbed lowered what remained of the prototype onto the gravel outside Cade Whitaker's gate, did not pause when her heel punched into the soft mud at the edge of the lot, and did not soften her expression when she turned and found a man standing there in a faded work shirt with grease darkening the creases of his knuckles, and a small girl half hidden behind him, watching everything with eyes that missed nothing at all. She reached into the pocket of her coat, produced the key fob, and let it fall into the mud without ceremony or explanation. "Keep it if you want," she said, her voice carrying the particular chill of someone who has decided that a thing, and perhaps the person receiving it, is no longer worth a single dollar of her attention. Cade did not argue, did not ask for clarification, and did not move until her black SUV had reversed back onto the county road and disappeared around the curve of pine trees at the edge of the property. Then, quietly, he bent down and picked the key up out of the mud. 2 weeks later, every person in Crestfall, Texas, stood in silence as the old iron gate at the end of his drive swung open, and something long and black and utterly impossible rolled out under the copper light of a late October afternoon. Stay with this one to the end, because what the CEO called worthless was about to cost her everything she thought she understood. The town of Crestfall sat at the southeastern edge of a county most maps forgot to label, the kind of place where the gas station doubled as the post office, and where the tallest building was the grain elevator that had been painted over twice in the last 40 years without ever quite losing the ghost of its original rust. Cade Whitaker had grown up in a house whose back fence bordered the salvage yard his father had run for 3 decades, and when his father died and left him the house and the yard and a truck with a cracked manifold, Cade had stood in the driveway for a long time before deciding that this was enough to build a life around, even if the life looked nothing like the one he had once imagined for himself. He was 39 years old, and he kept his hair short because it was practical, and he drove Piper to school every morning at 7:15 and made sure she had something warm in her stomach before she got out of the truck, and he came home to the yard and worked through the day in a silence that most people in town had eventually stopped trying to interpret. His neighbors had long ago concluded that Cade Whitaker was simply a quiet, unremarkable man who fixed other people's discarded things and seemed to find sufficient peace in that, and they were almost entirely wrong about him, though it would take the arrival of a wrecked car and the woman who brought it to make that fact undeniable. Piper was 8, and she had her mother's way of sitting very still and watching everything, a quality that some adults found unnerving, but that Cade had always understood as intelligence holding its breath before it said something worth saying. She kept a sketchbook under her bed, and in it she drew cars. Not the boxy shapes that children usually draw, but vehicles with actual geometry, with swept roof lines and aggressive wheel arches and side vents positioned exactly where a thermal engineer might place them, because she had grown up watching her father look at cars the way a surgeon looks at a body. And some of that precision had seeped into her without either of them noticing. She told anyone who would listen that her father was going to build the most beautiful car in the world one day, a declaration that most adults received with the polite half-smile reserved for children's impossible ambitions, and she had never once revised her opinion based on those smiles. The yard itself was unremarkable from the road, a long gravel drive, a chain-link fence topped with rusted wire, rows of vehicles in various states of disassembly, arranged with a tidiness that suggested the man who managed them thought of organization as a form of respect. But inside the main workshop, if you happened to step through the door on an afternoon when Cade was working, and the light was coming in at the right angle through the high clerestory windows, you could see that every tool had its place, and every part had its label, and every surface was clean in a way that spoke not of obsession, but of intention. 40 miles north, in the glass and steel building on the edge of the Austin Metro that housed the headquarters of Mercer Velocity, Celeste Mercer was having the kind of afternoon that makes people do things they later describe as necessary, but that are, in truth, simply acts of panic dressed in the language of strategy. The Mercer Vanta. The electric performance coupe that was supposed to announce the company's arrival in the ultra-premium segment and close a funding round that would carry them through the next 18 months of development, had lost stability at 63 miles per hour during an internal validation run, drifted wide on a banked section of the test track, and kissed the outer safety barrier hard enough to crumple the entire front fascia and displace the left suspension arm by 4 inches. No one was seriously hurt, which was the only clean fact in an otherwise very dirty afternoon. The prototype was supposed to have been ready for a curated media preview in 3 weeks, and the funding partners had already been flown in twice to watch demonstration runs that had proceeded without incident, and Celeste had told them, with the calm certainty that had made her the kind of CEO that investors trusted, that the Vanta's performance architecture was solved, mature, and ready for production commitment. Garrett Holloway had come to her office within 20 minutes of the incident, closing the door behind him with the deliberate quietness of a man who has already decided how this conversation will go. He was Mercer Velocity's Chief Technology Officer, a tall man with the precise diction and careful posture of someone who had been told early in his career that credibility was performed as much as earned, and he had spent the past 4 years performing it with considerable success inside the company. He told Celeste the failure was a driver input error, that the simulation data was clear, that the platform itself was sound, and that the worst thing she could do was let an independent analysis team anywhere near the vehicle before the funding round closed, because independent analysts had a way of finding things that weren't there and billing you for the privilege. He said the prototype needed to disappear quietly and quickly, that he knew of a small salvage operation outside the city that handled discrete disposals for automotive companies testing at the edge of their engineering, and that if she let him arrange it, the vehicle would be gone, and the story would be controlled before the morning news cycle had anything to work with. Celeste listened to all of this with her hands flat on her desk and her expression unreadable, and then she told him she would handle it herself, because she was the kind of person who believed that the things you could not delegate were precisely the things that defined you. She arrived at the Whitaker yard in the early afternoon, stepping down from the SUV into a light rain that she did not acknowledge because acknowledging the rain would have meant acknowledging that this was not the kind of place she was accustomed to conducting business. Cade came out of the workshop when he heard the vehicles, wiping his hands on a cloth that he folded and put in his back pocket with a neatness that struck her, in some distant way, as surprising. He asked, in a voice without inflection or anxiety, what service she was looking for: triage and parts salvage, long-term storage, or full disposal. And Celeste heard in those 3 options a vocabulary that told her this man had, at some point in his life, thought seriously about mechanical things, which she filed away and immediately dismissed because it was not relevant to what she needed from him. Delaney Brooks, her communications director, stood near the SUV and surveyed the yard with an expression she did not bother to conceal, one that said she found the entire setting slightly below the minimum standard for legitimate business interaction. One of the 2 security personnel who had accompanied them told Cade quietly that he would need to sign a liability waiver before touching any component of the vehicle, and Cade said he understood, and the waiver was produced, and Cade read it with an attention that nobody present had expected before he signed it with a ballpoint pen he produced from his own shirt pocket. Garrett had stayed at headquarters, which Cade noticed only because he had specifically looked for the man and found the absence of him more interesting than the presence of anyone else in the group. He turned his attention to the Vanta, which the flatbed had lowered onto the gravel, in a state that made clear the front structural rails had taken the full force of the barrier impact. The hood buckled upward along its center line, the left headlight assembly completely absent, the front diffuser cracked along both mounting points. But the manner in which the chassis had absorbed and distributed that load, visible in the deformation pattern of the aluminum subframe, in the way the firewall had remained perpendicular, while everything in front of it had crumpled progressively, told a story that had nothing to do with inadequate engineering and everything to do with engineering that had for a moment been asked to perform beyond a specific calibrated threshold. He walked the perimeter of the vehicle slowly, not touching it yet, reading it the way a person reads a sentence they have written themselves and are now encountering in someone else's handwriting. Piper had appeared in the doorway of the house and was looking at the car with the expression she reserved for drawings. She had not yet decided how to begin. And Celeste had glanced at her and said, with a precision of coldness that was clearly habitual, that children ought to be kept away from damaged machinery. Cade did not respond to this. He asked Piper to go inside, and Piper went, and then Celeste reached into her coat and produced the key fob and let it fall into the mud, and she said what she said, and Cade bent down and picked up the key with the quiet of a man who has long since learned that composure is the only form of dignity that cannot be taken from him. He looked at her without anger or subservience, his expression carrying something that was not quite recognition and not quite resignation, but was somewhere in the country between them. And he said, "There are things that look like scrap because the person who owned them never understood what they were made to do." Celeste received this the way she received most things from people she had already categorized, as a reflexive attempt at profundity from someone trying to recover face in a losing situation, and she offered the thin smile of a person whose time has a specific value and then walked back to the SUV. Garrett had called her twice during the drive back to the city, and she had not answered, and she told Delaney to draft a disposal confirmation for her records and to make sure the waiver was filed before end of business. In the yard behind her, Cade stood next to the wrecked car in the fading afternoon light, and he did not watch her go, because he was already looking at something else, a detail at the lower edge of the chassis tunnel, partially obscured by the buckled front rail that had stopped his breathing for exactly 3 seconds. He moved the Vanta into the secondary workshop after dark, working carefully with the yard crane and a hydraulic dolly that had belonged to his father and still bore the scratch marks of 30 years of use. Piper sat on a stool at the far end of the space, with her homework spread across the surface of a workbench, asking questions about the car with the systematic curiosity of a person who genuinely wants to understand rather than merely to fill silence. Cade told her the car had been designed well once, and then changed in ways that made it worse, and Piper thought about this for a while and then said that was like erasing the good parts of a drawing because someone told you they were too complicated, and Cade said yes, it was exactly like that. He began the initial assessment with a work light and a fiber optic inspection camera, going section by section through the undercarriage with the methodical patience of someone who already has a hypothesis and is simply building the evidence to support it. And what he found over the course of that first night confirmed everything that the deformation pattern had suggested from the outside. The rear chassis section, from the firewall rearward, was structurally intact. Not merely serviceable, but precisely, deliberately intact, as though whoever had designed it had built in a margin of integrity that exceeded the specification by a factor that spoke of personal investment rather than contractual obligation. He found the inscription at 11:30 when he had removed the lower diffuser panel and was working with a flashlight held at a shallow angle to read the stamping marks on the inner chassis rail. It was small, 8 millimeters tall, pressed into the metal during the original fabrication, the kind of identification mark that a careful engineer applies to prototype work, not for legal protection, but out of a habit of authorship, a refusal to let a significant piece of work go into the world without some trace of the person who brought it into being. It read, Whittaker Dynamic Spine, Prototype Layer 03. He put the flashlight down on the concrete floor and sat on his heels in the yellow circle of its beam for a long time, and if Piper had been awake and watching from her stool, she would have seen something cross her father's face that she had never seen there before. Not triumph, not anger, but the expression of a person who has just been handed back something they had stopped believing they would ever see again. The dynamic spine was his. The concept, the geometry, the layered response algorithm that gave the chassis its ability to modulate stiffness in real time based on surface feedback. He had developed all of it across 14 months in a small testing facility north of Dallas, working in the collaboration that had eventually become the foundation of Mercer Velocity's entire performance platform. He had developed it, and then Garrett Holloway had taken it. The memory of that period did not arrive all at once, but in the specific tactile way that old work memories arrive, through the hands more than the mind, through the recollection of specific problems solved at specific hours of the morning, through the sound of a particular test rig running at a particular frequency. He had been 31 when he first sketched the conceptual architecture of a chassis that could behave differently at each contact patch, that could sense the transition from dry to contaminated pavement and redistribute its lateral compliance in the time it took a driver's nervous system to register a change in steering feedback. He had been 32 when the first proof of concept had run clean through a wet surface slalom at speed without a single corrective input from the test driver, and the test driver had climbed out of the car and looked at Cade without speaking for several seconds before saying that he had driven 37 prototype vehicles, and that was the first time a car had felt like it was thinking. He had been 33 when Garrett Holloway had appeared with a licensing framework and a development timeline and a set of contract terms that Cade's lawyer, a friend, not a specialist, had told him were aggressive but not unusual for the industry. And he had signed because he trusted the handshake more than the paper, which was the specific mistake that had cost him everything. The contract had included a clause, written in the particular language of intellectual property transfer, that sounds routine when summarized and devastating when fully executed, that gave Mercer Velocity full rights to all derivative development. And Garrett had defined derivative so broadly that it consumed not just the licensed application, but the underlying concept, the methodology, and every future iteration. When Cade had refused to remove the third response layer of the stability algorithm to cut production costs, Garrett had exercised a provision that allowed the company to terminate his consulting arrangement for non-performance, filed a formal record stating that the original dynamic spine prototype had been unstable and that subsequent development had required complete re-engineering by the Mercer team, and had Cade's name removed from every document in the project file. He called Lawson Drake on the 5th morning, standing in the yard with a coffee that had gone cold while he thought about whether to make the call at all. Lawson was the other engineer who had been in the room when the dynamic spine first ran clean, a man who had left the industry 3 years after Cade had been pushed out and who now ran a small fabrication company in New Mexico that made suspension components for desert racing teams, and who had, by his own account, spent the intervening years trying to establish what a normal life felt like after years of working at the edge of what was physically possible. He answered on the 4th ring with the voice of a person who had been expecting the call for a long time and had been hoping, without real conviction that it would not come. Cade told him about the car, told him about the inscription, told him what he had found in the stability system and what that finding meant about the crash. Lawson was quiet for a long moment and then said, with the weariness of a man who has been holding something heavy for too long, "I kept copies of everything, Cade. I kept them because I was afraid of exactly this." He said he would send what he had, and that he would come in person when the time was right, and that he was sorry he had stayed quiet for as long as he had, and Cade told him there was nothing to be sorry for because the cost of speaking up was real, and Lawson had a business and a family, and Cade understood what silence sometimes cost a person. He also told Lawson, very quietly, that Garrett had not just copied the dynamic spine. He had bypassed its third response layer, the one that handled the transition logic between surface conditions, and the bypass was the reason the Vanta had gone wide on the banked section at 63 miles per hour. Not a driver error, an engineering omission that Garrett had known about and concealed. The work itself took on a different quality after that conversation, more deliberate, less exploratory, the quality of work done by someone who knows exactly what they are building and why. He stripped the crash-damaged front section entirely, set aside every component that could be reclaimed, and began fabricating replacement parts using the lathe and mill his father had acquired secondhand in the early 90s and maintained with a devotion that had kept them accurate to tolerances tighter than their age had any right to support. He worked through the nights with the workshop radio tuned low to the country station from Lubbock that his father had always played, and Piper sat with him on the evenings when her homework was done, sometimes drawing, sometimes just watching him work with the focused patience of a child who understands that some kinds of attention are a form of love. On the 10th evening she looked at the car, which by then had shed its original livery entirely and was bare aluminum and carbon and the flat black of the structural coating Cade had applied to the chassis repairs, and she said it looked like a blackbird, one of the ones that perched on the fence posts along the south pasture of the neighboring property in the early morning. Cade looked at the car and understood immediately that she was right, that the long, low profile and the way the light moved across the undulating surface of the bodywork carried exactly that quality of compact, precise darkness. He did not intend to keep the name. He scratched it into the inner surface of the dashboard panel anyway, next to a small silhouette of a bird with its wings half open, and told himself it was just for Piper, and both of them knew that was not entirely true. On the 12th day, he began reshaping the exterior panels. He did not attempt to restore the Vanta's original appearance, partly because the original tooling had not been his, and partly because the original appearance had been designed around a set of priorities that he did not share. The priority of visual drama over aerodynamic integrity, the priority of width and stance over the kind of sectional efficiency that makes a fast car feel inevitable rather than aggressive. What emerged from the workshop over those 2 days was shaped by the same hand that had sketched the dynamic spine's conceptual geometry, low and tapered and deliberate, the bodywork following the airflow paths that Cade knew by instinct because he had once spent 14 months thinking about nothing else. Every surface change functional, every junction resolved cleanly, the whole vehicle carrying the particular authority of something that has been built to be correct rather than to be impressive. He finished at 3 in the morning on the 14th day, tightened the last fastener on the undertray, and sat on the shop floor for a while before he started the car. The first attempt failed because of a corrupted handshake in the battery management system, and Piper, who had been asleep on the workshop couch and had woken up at the sound of the failed startup, came over and put her hand over his and said, "You always fix the things everybody else gives up on." He reset the handshake protocol, restored the dynamic spine's third response layer from the original specification in the documentation Lawson had sent, and tried again. The startup sequence completed without fault. The instrument display lit up in full, the cooling fans cycled through their initialization, and the electric drivetrain came online with the quiet, steady note of something that had been built right from the beginning and had been waiting, with considerable patience, for someone to turn the key. He drove it first on the service road behind the property in the hour before dawn, without headlights, with the windows down and the cold morning air carrying the smell of cedar and damp earth that he had grown up breathing, and that was, in some way he could not articulate, inseparable from his sense of what it meant to do work that mattered. The car moved with the quality that only the dynamic spine's third layer could produce, not merely responsive but anticipatory, reading the road surface through its sensors and adjusting its lateral compliance a fraction of a second before any conventional system would have reacted, so that the experience of driving it was not a conversation between driver and machine but something closer to a shared intention. He made 2 full passes of the service road and then brought the car back to the yard and parked it inside, and sat in the driver's seat for a while in the dark with his hands in his lap. He did not feel triumphant. He felt, as nearly as he could describe it, restored, as though something that had been removed from the world without consent had been quietly returned to its proper place, and the world had become, by exactly that amount, more true than it had been the day before. The notification that the footage had spread widely came from his neighbor's son, a 17-year-old named Cooper, who had been standing at the end of his family's drive with a phone in his hand when the Blackbird rolled out through the gate in the early light, and who had captured the full 40 seconds of its emergence on video before Cade had seen him and raised a hand in acknowledgement. Cooper's caption read, "Single dad turned the CEO's crash car into this, from the junkyard. 2 weeks." The footage showed the gate opening, the first glimpse of the black nose emerging from the shadow of the yard, the full reveal as the car crossed the threshold and settled onto the county road surface, the low sun catching the bodywork and moving across it in the slow, continuous way that light moves across something that has been shaped with exceptional care. By the time Celeste Mercer saw it, the footage had been viewed by several 100,000 people, and the comment sections were running parallel conversations. One about the technical improbability of what they were seeing, one about the human story behind it, and one, smaller but growing, in which people who knew automotive engineering were beginning to ask specific questions about the platform they were looking at, and whether it bore any resemblance to something that had been publicly discussed and then quietly discontinued in the technical literature several years earlier. Delaney Brooks called Celeste at 6:40 in the morning, which told Celeste that whatever had happened was serious, because Delaney operated on the principle that nothing requiring a 6:40 call was ever resolved quickly or cheaply. She identified the license plate from the footage in under 4 minutes, a Mercer Velocity experimental registration that had been on the wrecked prototype, and the realization that arrived with that identification was one that Celeste felt not in her mind, but in the specific physical way that certain kinds of understanding arrive, in the sternum first and then spreading outward. She drove to Crestfall herself, again and again without a large retinue, just Delaney and one of the security personnel, and, because she had called him as an afterthought and then regretted it immediately, Garrett Holloway. Cade was in the yard when they arrived, working a chamois over the Blackbird's hood with the unhurried attention of someone who has no reason to be nervous, and Piper was sitting on the hood of an old sedan nearby with her sketchbook open, watching the visitors with the clear-eyed assessment of a child who has been watching adults reveal their real intentions for all 8 years of her conscious existence. Celeste got out of the car and looked at the blackbird for a full 15 seconds without speaking, and the nature of that silence was different from anything she had brought to this yard the first time. It was the silence not of contempt but of recalculation, of a person updating a model that has just been shown to be incorrect in a way that changes most of its other outputs. She told Cade the vehicle was property of Mercer Velocity and that she needed it returned. Cade said, with the same unperturbed evenness that he had brought to everything, that she had released the vehicle to him under a salvage and disposal agreement that transferred all handling rights upon delivery, that Delaney had handed him the paperwork herself, and that the key she had dropped in the mud had been accompanied by explicit verbal relinquishment. Delaney's expression when Cade said, "This was the expression of a person who has just understood that a decision they made quickly and without sufficient attention has become, in retrospect, a very significant decision indeed." Garrett stepped forward and told Cade he was in possession of proprietary technology belonging to Mercer Velocity, and that unauthorized modification of the vehicle constituted a violation of trade secret protections, and Cade looked at him with the specific look of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment, with the patience of someone who knew, long before anyone else in the conversation, what the last line of the scene was going to be. He opened the hood of the Blackbird and pointed to the chassis rail inscription. He said, without raising his voice, "You want to tell me how I stole something that had my name on it before Mercer Velocity gave it a product name." The yard was very quiet. A hawk was crossing the sky above the tree line to the south, and the sound of the county road was distant and ordinary, and Garrett Holloway did not speak. Cade told Celeste, step by step and without drama, what he had found inside the vehicle. The bypassed third response layer, the deformation pattern consistent with a system asked to perform outside its calibrated range, the specific parameters that Garrett had removed from the stability algorithm to reduce development cost and compress the timeline to launch. He said the car had not failed because the technology was flawed. It had failed because someone had taken a working safety system and surgically removed the part that made it work, and then covered the removal by attributing the failure to the engineer who had originally designed it. Celeste listened without interrupting, her hands at her sides, her face carrying the particular quality of a person who is trying to determine whether the ground they are standing on is as solid as they had believed. Brielle Dawson had come with the group at Celeste's specific instruction because Brielle was the youngest member of the engineering team and the only one who had ever quietly and once put a concern about the Vanta's wet surface stability in writing and then watched that concern get classified as resolved without being told what the resolution was. She asked Cade's permission to look at the telemetry data, and he unlocked the Blackbird's diagnostic port without hesitation, and she spent 20 minutes with a laptop on the hood of the car before she straightened up and looked at Celeste with the expression of someone who has just confirmed something they had been hoping to find a way to disbelieve. Every stability metric in the post-restoration dataset was cleaner and more consistent than anything the Vanta had produced in its best official test run, not by a marginal amount, but by the kind of margin that speaks to a fundamental architectural difference rather than a tuning improvement. The third response layer, restored to its original specification, was performing exactly as the design had intended it to perform. Cycling through its surface assessment logic on a 40 millisecond interval, redistributing lateral stiffness before the mechanical consequences of a road surface transition became a driver problem. Garrett said the data was meaningless without context, that Cade had specifically tuned the system to perform on this road surface, and the numbers would not generalize, and Brielle said with a precision that she had clearly been holding carefully for a long time. The third layer is adaptive by definition. That's what it does. If it only worked on one road surface, it wouldn't be the third layer, it would just be a fixed compliance map. The yard was quiet again after that, and Garrett did not respond, and Celeste looked at her CTO with the expression of a person conducting a very rapid and very final audit of their trust. Lawson Drake arrived that afternoon with a box that he had kept under a false floor in his office storage room for 6 years, which was, he said, the kind of paranoid precaution that you talk yourself into thinking is unnecessary and then never actually dismantle, because some part of you knows better. The box contained printed engineering notebooks, a hard drive with timestamp development files, a set of prototype test reports with Cade's signature on each page, and a thread of emails from Garrett Holloway dated 18 months before the dynamic spine had been incorporated into the Vanta's chassis design, in which Garrett had asked Cade to document the third-layer response logic in a specific format that, Lawson explained, was the exact format used for internal IP transfer submissions at Mercer Velocity. Lawson had seen those emails as routine at the time. He had understood what they meant only later, when Cade had already been removed from the project and Garrett had filed the re-engineering claim. He put the box on the trunk of the Blackbird and looked at Garrett and said, very simply, that he was sorry he had not said this sooner, and that the reason he had not was not principle but fear, and that the distinction mattered to him even if it did not change the outcome. Celeste examined the materials for a long time, standing in the late afternoon light with the notebook open across her forearm, and the silence she maintained had a different quality from any silence she had brought to the yard before it. It was the silence of someone dismantling something they had built carefully and lived inside comfortably, and were now, at considerable personal cost, recognizing as structurally false. She came back that evening without Garrett, and without the security personnel, and without the apparatus of executive authority that she normally carried as a kind of involuntary weather system. She came with Delaney, in Delaney's car rather than her own, and she stood on the porch of the small white house at the edge of the yard and knocked on the door the way a person knocks when they do not know what they are going to say, but understand that saying nothing is no longer an option. Cade answered with a dish towel over his shoulder, and through the lit rectangle of the doorway she could see Piper at the kitchen table with the scattered materials of a school project arranged around her, and the ordinariness of the scene, the dinner plates still drying in the rack, the low sound of the radio in the next room, the child looking up from her work with curious eyes, was something that landed on Celeste in a way she had not prepared for. She said, "I came to apologize." Not to negotiate, not to manage, just to apologize. Cade stood in the doorway for a moment and then opened it wider and asked if she wanted to sit down, and she said she did not deserve to sit down, but she would, and they sat on the porch steps while Delaney waited in the drive, and the night came in around them with the sound of the cedar trees and the distant call of something nocturnal moving in the pasture beyond the fence. She told him she had believed Garrett because believing Garrett had been convenient, which was not an excuse, and she was not offering it as one. She told him she had looked at the yard and the house and the work shirt and made a calculation about what kind of person he was, and that the calculation had been the product of assumptions she was ashamed of. Cade listened without either forgiving her immediately or withholding the possibility of it, which was, she thought, the most dignified response available to him and the one he had clearly earned through long practice. She told him she wanted to bring the full situation before the Mercer Velocity Board. He asked what she expected from a board meeting. She said she expected it to be the hardest professional experience of her life, and that Von Mercer, her uncle and the board member who had spent the better part of 2 years engineering her professional displacement so he could reclaim operational control of the company, would use the disclosure as a weapon, and that she was going to do it anyway, because the alternative was to be the kind of CEO who chose the comfortable lie over the expensive truth, and she had spent too long building a company to let it stand on that foundation. Cade told her that if she was serious, there were 3 things that needed to be publicly established: that the Whittaker dynamic spine was his original work, that the third response layer had been removed by Garrett in contravention of his own safety documentation, and that every Vanta unit currently in pre-production needed to be reassessed before delivery. Delaney, who had drifted closer to the porch during this conversation, said quietly that the reassessment would delay launch by 8 to 12 months, that the funding partners would need to be called, and that the share price would move. Cade said, "The car I pulled out of this yard and gave back its third layer, that car works. The one she brought me doesn't. That's the whole story, and it's available to anybody who wants to look." Celeste nodded. She stood up to leave, and then stopped and said she needed to ask him one more thing. She asked what he actually wanted for himself, not for the record. What outcome existed for him in this? Cade looked through the doorway to where Piper had fallen asleep over her project, her cheek on her forearm, the sketchbook open to a drawing of a low black car with a bird in flight on its nose, and he said, "I want her to grow up knowing her father's name belongs to something real." The board meeting convened at Mercer Velocity headquarters on a Tuesday morning, and the Blackbird was in the lobby when the board members arrived. Not roped off or elevated on a platform, but simply parked on the polished concrete floor beside the reception desk, the way a piece of evidence is placed. Without ceremony, available for inspection, asking nothing except to be looked at honestly. The Mercer Vanta prototype, carrying its official pre-production livery, and the performance specifications that the communications team had prepared for the investor preview, stood beside it, and the juxtaposition was one that required no annotation. Vaughn Mercer was the second board member through the door, and he stopped when he saw the 2 vehicles and understood the staging, and he looked at his niece with an expression that was trying to be contempt and landing closer to apprehension. He had spent the preceding 72 hours coordinating with Garrett to construct a counter-narrative in which Cade Whittaker was a disgruntled former contractor attempting to leverage a failed IP dispute through manufactured public sympathy, and the counter-narrative had seemed plausible in the conference room where it had been assembled, but standing in the lobby looking at the Blackbird, it suddenly seemed like the kind of thing that requires its audience to choose not to see what is directly in front of them. Celeste presented the evidence without theater. Brielle displayed the telemetry comparison, Blackbird's third-layer performance against the Vanta's best official run, and walked the board through what the data meant in terms of real-world wet surface stability, translating the engineering into language that made the consequence of the missing layer impossible to abstract. Lawson's documentation established the authorship timeline with the precision of a man who had kept records specifically, because he feared they would one day be necessary. Delaney presented the salvage transfer paperwork and walked through the legal status of the vehicle's possession without editorializing, because the facts were editorial enough. Garrett said the situation had been mischaracterized, that the development history was complex, that decisions made in a commercial engineering environment could not be fairly evaluated through the retrospective application of academic attribution standards, and each sentence he produced seemed, in the room, to make his position smaller rather than larger. Vaughn made the argument that Celeste's disclosure represented a catastrophic failure of executive judgment, and that the board had an obligation to its shareholders to replace leadership that had brought a third party's private grievance into a fiduciary setting, and Celeste let him finish, and then said, "The company lost its value on the day we called the truth disposable. I'm trying to get it back." Cade, who had been sitting at the table without having spoken, stood up, and said that he had not come to claim anything that belonged to anyone else, that the technology in question was a safety system, and that his concern was not primarily proprietary, but practical. The Vanta as currently configured would fail again under the same conditions, and the people who would be in those vehicles deserved to know that the platform had been compromised. The board voted. Garrett was suspended pending formal investigation. Vaughn's financial relationship with the company was referred to the audit committee, and Celeste was authorized to proceed with a project restructuring under independent technical oversight, with Cade designated as consulting architect and his authorship formally restored to the project record. Celeste offered to buy the Blackbird at a number that was meant to convey seriousness. Cade said no, with the specific, uncomplicated quality of a refusal that has not been preceded by deliberation because the deliberation happened years earlier. He said the car was not a product, and not a demonstration, and not a symbol. It was a thing that he and Piper had made together from what someone else had thrown away, and that distinction mattered to him in a way that no figure on a check could address. Celeste said she understood, and he believed that she did, and the conversation moved to what a real collaboration would look like, one without the architecture of subordination and intellectual appropriation that had defined his first engagement with the company. He said he would accept a formal consulting structure with 3 written conditions: that all safety documentation be archived independently of the commercial timeline, that any engineer on the project had standing to raise a concern without routing it through commercial approval, and that no response layer of the stability system would be modified without a full test protocol and a signed technical sign-off from the lead engineer of record, which would be him. These conditions were not negotiable. Celeste agreed to all 3, and Delaney drafted the framework that afternoon in a conference room at the Crestfall Motel, working on a laptop on a table that still had coffee rings from the previous guest. And nobody remarked on this because it seemed appropriate that the thing being built was being built somewhere unglamorous and real. Brielle joined the independent technical team as its first engineer and brought with her the 6 months of concern she had been carrying quietly, which turned out, once given a place to be examined, to be a detailed and documented record of every anomaly she had flagged and every flag that had been administratively reclassified. Lawson came on as a design consultant, operating out of Crestfall 2 days a week from a desk in the corner of Cade's secondary workshop that they furnished with a chair from the salvage pile and a lamp that needed its shade replaced. Delaney issued a public statement that was not written in the defensive, passive voice of institutional crisis management, but in the direct first-person voice of a company saying, "We built something wrong. We buried the person who built it right, and here is specifically what we are doing about both of those facts." The statement was discussed at length by automotive journalists and engineering ethicists, and people who covered corporate governance, and the predominant response was a kind of surprised attention, the attention that a system receives when it behaves in a way it is not expected to behave, which is to say, honestly. Cade read it once, put his phone down, and went back to the yard where there was a 1991 Japanese sports coupe waiting for him that needed its rear subframe assessed and a verdict delivered on whether it was worth saving. The Mercer Velocity relaunch event took place in the spring in the testing facility north of Austin, where the original dynamic spine had first been validated on a wet surface course a decade earlier, a choice of venue that Celeste had made herself, and that she had not explained to the communications team because she felt that some things communicated themselves more clearly without annotation. She stood on the stage in front of 400 people. Journalists, funding partners, engineers, and a small contingent from Crestfall that included Cooper and his parents, and the couple who ran the gas station post office, and several other people who had stood outside the salvage yard 2 weeks after the CEO's visit and watched in disbelief as something beautiful rolled out of it. And she said that the company had made a mistake, and that the mistake had not been technical in origin but had been the product of a culture that had treated the inconvenient truth as an obstacle to be managed rather than a foundation to be honored, and that the version of the Vanta being presented today was different from its predecessor in ways that went past the engineering because the engineering had been corrected by someone they had once called a junkyard mechanic and owed more than they could adequately repay. Piper sat in the front row between Lawson and Brielle, with her sketchbook on her knees and the drawing of the blackbird open to the page, and she was not watching the stage, she was watching the entrance at the far end of the facility floor. Cade drove the blackbird through that entrance at the moment Celeste finished speaking, not quickly and not slowly, the car moving with the quality that the dynamic spine's third layer produces when the driver has the confidence to trust it completely, that quality of a thing in conversation with its environment rather than in contest with it. He parked at the center of the floor and got out without looking at the crowd, because he was not there for the crowd. He was there because a piece of work he had done in honest faith had been taken from him and had spent years in a form that did not serve the purpose it had been built to serve, and now it had been given back and was doing what it was supposed to do, and that was the entirety of what mattered to him. Celeste introduced him as the founding architect of the Whittaker dynamic spine, and the room was generous in its response. And Cade stood next to the car with his hands at his sides and looked at his daughter in the front row. And she raised the sketchbook so he could see the drawing, the low black car, and the bird with its wings half open, and he stood a little straighter. Garrett's departure from the company had been announced the previous week through a filing that used the language of mutual agreement, and that everybody read correctly. Vaughn's relationship to the board had been restructured by the audit committee in a way that removed his influence over operational decisions, which was not the outcome Vaughn had intended when he had first encouraged Garrett to bring the prototype disposal to a small yard outside the city. And the distance between the intended outcome and the actual one was the distance that competence, patience, and a willingness to do careful work in obscurity will sometimes produce, given enough time and the right kind of evidence. The sign on the wall of the workshop, when Cade returned to Crestfall that evening, and pulled through the gate and parked the blackbird in its place in the secondary workshop, and stood for a moment in the smell of motor oil and cedar shavings, and the particular metallic coolness of the building at night, read Whittaker Garage and Design, stenciled in the same block lettering his father had used on the original yard sign, though the name had been updated and the sign was new. Piper had helped him paint it on the Saturday after the board vote, climbing the stepladder with the brush while Cade steadied the ladder from below and read the letter spacing to her, and she had done it with the careful attention she brought to anything that mattered, taking her time at each character, making sure it was right. A few weeks after the relaunch, a man drove up in a low Italian coupe with a turbocharger that had developed a surge problem, and he stood in the yard looking around with the expression of someone who has been told something is here that he cannot quite reconcile with what he is looking at. And Piper came out of the house and asked if she could help. He said he was looking for the engineer who had built the Blackbird, that his mechanic back in Dallas had said there was no better understanding of high-performance chassis dynamics anywhere in the state than this address. Piper looked at the Italian car for a moment and then looked at the man and said, "Here we don't see junk. We see what other people haven't figured out yet." She led him inside to find her father, past the Blackbird sitting quietly in the corner of the workshop under the amber light, and through the same gate that had swung open on a quiet October afternoon, and let something extraordinary roll out into the light.
Check my name. Oh shit! Oh, uh-oh. Holy shit, dude, this guy's strong as fuck. God damn it. Looking more like 5, bro. He's fast, bro. That ain't right. What up, Eddie Joel? He cheated, though, bro. He's cheating the whole way through, bro. Doing illegal moves and shit. Come on, it's alright. There we go. Let's get it. Warm up, yeah, bro. My fucking controller is broken and shit.